The Penn Museum in Philadelphia is issuing an apology for its collection of 1,300 skulls, including those belonging to Black and American slaves from Cuba. The museum's director says, quote, "It is time for these individuals to be returned to their ancestral communities wherever possible as a step toward atonement and repair for the racist and colonial practices that were integral to the formation of these collections." The news comes following multiple demonstrations calling for the bones to be returned to descendants. Joining me now with more is Dr. Tukufu Zuberi. He is curator of the African Galleries at the Penn Museum. He's also a professor of race relations and sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Zuberi, good to see you. Help me understand why this decision is coming now. I am of the belief that institutions of the powerful don't have feelings, they have interests. And if they're doing this now, there's a reason. Help me make sense of it, or tell me I'm just being too cynical.
I think you're hitting it right on the head, because really what we're talking about is no less than the national narrative of what it means to be a citizen in the United States. And you got to imagine that museums in the United States before COVID had about 850 visits per year. Now that's a lot of people, and they serve as a major way to educate the general public. African Americans, white folks, all kind of folks been in the streets talking about Black Lives Matter. And when Black Lives Matter, you can no longer maintain a racist interpretation of the national narrative. Most museums present a narrative of US history which is grounded in white supremacy. And it's time to end that. So there are discussions all over the country about how you decolonize these spaces, how you take the racism out of museum curation. And that's what's at stake.
Let's talk a little bit about the decolonization of museums, because for a lot of people, and you started to talk about this already, for a lot of people, the museum is just where we find history. The museum is just where we find out what already happened. And a lot of people, most of us aren't trained or conditioned to think about how the museum got the stuff, how we end up with skulls from Cuba or Africa, or on the continent of Africa, we've seen universities take all kinds of stuff. We saw a university in Europe, I think about 3 weeks ago, return stuff back to stolen land. How they got there in the first place is the question that we don't interrogate. How does this happen? How is that a part of colonization?
So, as part of the Enlightenment, they created museums. So museums had the role of basically explaining to people the history of the nation, whether it was Britain or London or the United States. They help explain the history of the physical structure of the earth, of the planets, of all of this. So people come to museums to find out about their roots, about their history. And the colonial part of it is that most of these objects in these museums, like these skulls, were collected during a time of enslavement or colonialization for Africa and African people. And so that is the story. That is the narrative you find in these museums, with the exceptions of those museums which were created to counter this narrative, like the African American Museum of History and Culture in DC, or the DeSabo Museum in Chicago. And so we do have, I don't want to make it look like there has been no struggle until now. But this effort to decolonize the museum space has grown, and people want to change what history is taught in these museums. And this is how we do that. We get them to repatriate stolen things and things of that nature.
I'm glad you used the word stolen, because 51 skulls of enslaved Africans that were dug out of a graveyard in Cuba are part of the issue that we're talking about. Several skulls, in fact, were believed to have belonged to Black Philadelphians, likely bought from grave robbers. So just to give people the context here before we go, you have a museum of anthropology and archaeology at Ivy League University in Philadelphia that is in possession of skulls that were stolen by enslaved Africans throughout the diaspora, and some of whom ended up right in the very city that the museum is in. I mean, this is an egregious and gross kind of demonstration of just how vicious colonization and colonialism is. The question I have for you before we go, Dr. Zuberi, though, is what role did the people play in making this happen? Again, the university didn't have a conversion experience. They didn't get religious. They didn't decide this is just wrong. The people applied pressure. How important was people power and people's resistance to getting this stuff done?
The people's protest was essential. As you said, they didn't just come up with this idea. They came up with this idea because we were protesting the death of Floyd. We were protesting what happened to all of these people who have been killed by the brutality of the police. We were snatching down statues of Robert E. Lee in the celebration of the Confederacy. So all of this has culminated in a demand specifically for Penn to decolonize its space and to remove this insulting display of the skulls of enslaved individuals who didn't say they could have these skulls, and the 15 or so Philadelphians whose skulls were dug up and simply sold to Mr. Morton are another way of insulting the integrity of our humanity. So the people's movement in the streets got Penn to consider how they're going to repatriate these objects. But it also got Penn to redesign its Africa galleries and to redesign them around decolonization. So the museum itself is trying to figure a way to be relevant in the 21st century. And for museums to be relevant in the 21st century, they must decolonize. They must undo the racial legacy of white supremacy that they have given us as history over all these years.
See, that's why we got Black News tonight. There's no other news show in the world where we're going to have this conversation at 8 p.m. on cable news. Dr. Zuberi, thank you so much for joining me, and we hope other museums will look at this as an example and repatriate those ancestral articles that were illegally acquired, not just from the continent of Africa, but from everywhere.